So it's really an honor and a privilege to be the chair of this panel here. Our subject will be Zeitenwende in Europe, perspectives on the future of EU enlargement in times of war. Yeah, let me just very briefly introduce my guests. It's ladies first by alphabetical order, Cristina Gherasimov, political scientist and foreign policy advisor to the President of the Republic of Moldova, Maia Sandu, from Chisinau. I'm happy to greet Irina Solonenko from Ukraine, also political scientist, and now Ukraine program director at the Centrum Liberale Moderne in Berlin. And then also by alphabetical order, Mr. Ditmir Bushati, Albanian politician from the Socialist Party and former foreign minister from 2013 until 2018. Mr. Ruprecht, Polenz, Christian Democrat politician and since long-term member of the German Parliament and since 2013 president of the German Society for Eastern Europe Research, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Osteuropakunde. And last but not least, Manuel Sarrazin, you know him all, so I don't think I have to introduce him. A little bit apart from our subject, I just want to make a personal remark maybe. It's been yesterday 1 year that the Russia's war against Ukraine has started, and I feel that I cannot ignore it. Now, we have a lot of discussions in Germany on what Ukrainians should do, with whom they should negotiate, with Russia, with Putin, and so on. Today, there will be a demonstration in Berlin following the manifest of Alice Schwarzer and Sarah Wagenknecht. And I'm always wondering, why don't we ask Ukrainians and just keep silent and ask them what they want? So, Irina, first, I would just like very briefly, how do you feel? What do you think after 1 year of this horrible attack of Russia against your country?
Yes, I just think that. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for organizing this discussion. I think that the whole rule-based order humankind created after the Second World War proved to be irrelevant or proved not to be able to enforce the rules which were set up and which Russia assigned to. So for me, this is the biggest problem. And whenever this war is over, we will have to deal with this problem if we want to have a long-term peace in Europe. So this would be the short answer. But also I would say, since you mentioned this manifest, we can end the war tomorrow if Russia moves out, yeah? But Ukraine cannot stop the war because Ukraine then will stop existing if Ukraine stops fighting. So it's very important to support Ukraine, and there can now be peace if peace is not justful. And there can now be peace if people in occupied territories suffer, are being killed and so on, and tortured, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Now starting the discussion on our subject, Manuel Sarrazin, my first question to you, as you represent the German government now, you have been dealing with the Western Balkans for a long time and with EU enlargement and integration process. Now, this process has been practically dead, I think we could say, integrating the Western Balkans. Now, all of a sudden, Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova have become EU membership candidates, which was very surprising in a way. What are your thoughts about this after having had such a delay with Western Balkan integration and then these two new candidates?
Well, I have to confess that I was doing advocacy for outspoken candidates European perspective for Ukraine since 2004. So I strongly believed regarding Ukraine that it wasn't the Eastern Partnership or the tries of doing the DCFTA with Ukraine, which brought actually Maidan in place, but a successful enlargement in Central Eastern Europe from 2004 and 2007, which made it so obvious to Ukrainians where on which side of the new Iron Curtain you want to live, actually. So my view is not the typical Balkan view. And I also have to confess that when I was meeting last time President Zelensky in 2021, I was quoting to him the episode of a serial when he gets the call from Merkel, who is ought to be to Montenegro. And I told him that, listen, every positive step in enlargement in the Western Balkans will be positive for Ukraine to have a perspective, perhaps one day to become a member. And I try to elaborate this now very strongly and sometimes roughly to the Western Balkans region, that it is the biggest luck for them that with Ukraine and Moldova, enlargement is back as the obviously only successful, powerful geopolitical instrument the European Union really has in its hand.
And do you think the European Union is serious about it now?
The European Union, first, it's not the most decisive question if the European Union is really serious. Sometimes you start with a relationship without being serious, and in the end, it's really serious, good or bad. Second, even if the European Union isn't serious, it would be really wrong if Germany is honest on that. If Germany doesn't believe, nobody will believe anymore. And you know, in Christianity, you have this Glaube, Liebe, Hoffnung, believing, love, hope. So believing is the first point, especially in the Western Balkans, especially German believing. And if we believe more than the friends look like not believing, it's also good for the sake of the thing. Third, I think that this the simple thing that enlargement policy is the geopolitical instrument. This is more acknowledged than 1 year ago among leadership in European Union. And I also have to confess that in Germany, with the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister, two politicians who already believed that before are at the place. So on this part of believing we are not perfect, but we are more credible than 1 year ago, also towards Western Balkans. I think that the one problem is that in Western Balkans, everybody thinks that they are so much ahead of Ukraine because they don't know Ukraine and what unbelievable, powerful society Ukraine has. And also that the support of European Union technically wise to Ukraine is quite remarkable. So that Ukraine might be much more faster than some politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina expected to be. And sometimes this is a link which then I'm getting quite rough, and then the Western Balkan people are thinking I'm against them because I try to explain that Ukraine is not so far lagging behind than the Western Balkans as they might think from the procedural perspective. But Ditmir can perhaps more diplomatically elaborate on that.
Yeah, we come to that later. Irina and Cristina, I would just like to ask you about your thoughts. Now, the Eastern Partnership Program has been, well, also practically dead, or was at least not very successful. And now your countries are EU member candidate countries. Yeah, what are your thoughts about it? Is it more than symbolistic?
Eastern Partnership might not have been successful as a geopolitical project, but it has been successful in terms of bringing Ukraine closer to the European Union. Ukraine implements association agreement, which part of which is a deep and comprehensive free trade area, something which Western Balkans do not have. It's kind of a part, it's a possibility of being a part of the single market or becoming a part of the single market of the EU. And so since 2014, Ukraine is implementing this agreement, and Ukraine has made progress in some areas. It's still behind most of the Western Balkan system if you look at this 5 grading system. And we will have reports, a package of reports in the autumn by Ukraine will also be featured, and we will see that Ukraine is a little bit behind, for instance, Albania and Montenegro. But still, Ukraine has made some progress. Yeah.
Cristina?
Does it work? Yes. For Moldova, I would say that I have a different view on the Eastern Partnership. I agree with Irina that it was not a failure. It did not have the security component so far, but it was really about bringing societies closer to the EU. So from an economic perspective, from the connectivity perspective, from a good governance perspective, these countries have become closer to the EU. Unfortunately, we somehow skip everything and look only at, how these countries are fighting corruption or how they are reforming the justice sector. So from this perspective, I agree that the Eastern Partnership has not done a lot. But the Eastern Partnership as a policy has never had a different objective in mind than to bring benefits to the people and bring these societies closer. So here I agree with Irina that it was a good instrument. In terms of the EU, I see it always as a project of peace from the very beginning of it. And I would not say that Moldova or Ukraine are so different. We have instances where countries were invited to become members to bring hope to these societies that they can get over an authoritarian regime faster, or that military dictatorships are gone and you can democratize and you can transform your societies into a better place. So here again, I don't see that somehow offering candidate status for Moldova or Ukraine is so different. At the same time,
sorry, so symbols can bring a lot of hope, but is it serious? Do you think it's serious, or?
I think it's what we do about this. It's important for Moldova and Ukraine to be serious, and I think both countries are showing very determined political will that they are serious about this. In terms of the European Union, I think we've seen a lot of changes in the slow bureaucracy in Brussels in the last year. And even though it was a political opportunity and a political decision, what happened last June in Brussels, I think it can go beyond simply a symbolic gesture for these two countries.
Yeah, sure.
I want to make a short addition to make a link to the current situation, the war. In November 2013, Ukrainian people went to the streets because Ukrainian president decided not to sign the association agreement with the EU, which had been negotiated for several years. And this was a starting point of the so-called revolution of dignity, which lasted for almost 3 months and which left almost 100 protesters killed by snipers, and Ukrainian president fled to Russia. So if Ukrainian people didn't go to the street back then, and they were inspired by the prospect of having the association agreement, Ukraine would have been a vassal state like Belarus now, and this war, this full-scale invasion wouldn't have happened because Russia wouldn't need to do this. But because Ukraine moved to the European Union, Russia had no other choice but just to invade like this. So I think it's important to mention that the prospect of having the agreement inspired people of Ukraine to change the turn of history.
And well, I mean, Brussels could have noticed back then, right? I mean, if you mention
the stupidity of Brussels not being geopolitical in that moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, but Ukraine didn't apply for membership, right? So I think it's okay. And the association agreement, as I mentioned, was a very good preparation for where we're now.
Perhaps, sorry to have too much talking time, but in that moment, I remember until summer 13, important political forces from, for example, Greens and some CDU members also were against signing the DCFTA with Ukraine because of human rights and the intonation of Madame, the former Prime Minister, sorry? Tymoshenko, right. And I remember quite clearly, we were with an MP delegation in Lithuania and the foreign minister told us, it's about geopolitical, not about human rights. And we were not clear on that, it was wrong, yeah? So it was perhaps also our fault. I don't know what was your personal position at that time, but European Union was not able in that moment to see the geopolitical momentum regarding Ukraine in the depths which it was lying. That is at least my personal opinion. Yeah.
Mr. Bushati, now turning to the Western Balkans, how is it disappointing that for a country like Albania, which has been waiting for so long to start accession negotiations, and now it's entangled with Macedonia and it's not moving on, and now there are two new like candidates? How do you feel about it?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, coming from Southeast Europe, because we have been used to have either München or Vienna as the capital of Southeast Europe. Now we are moving towards the north, and this is, I hope this is, I hope this is a good sign. Speaking about EU enlargement or EU accession process, nowadays it's a bit complicated, as you rightly pointed out. When it comes to the granting of the candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, I think this has been perceived positively in our neighborhood. I really don't know the sentiments of politicians in Bosnia, as Manuel was pointing at it. But I think there is a positive aspect, because it has also changed the perception about this EU finality. Many pundits in Western Europe have been thinking that Western Balkans 6 is equal to EU finality, but now we see that the process is moving on slowly and bit by bit also in the eastern part of European Union. Why I'm starting with the perception of the borders? Because when it comes to the Western Balkans, we are like an underbelly of EU, because we are surrounded by EU member states. You have Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, and Slovenia. And this is the last, let's say, bit when it comes to our corner of Europe. This is the first comment. The second one, speaking about candidate status, I've been in the driving seat of this process, and I still remember how excited we were, because it's a kind of political recognition for the reform process, but it shows also the sense of direction that the country is moving towards European Union. Nowadays, we find ourselves being professional candidates, EU candidates. Of course, North Macedonians were in a worse situation compared to us, but Turks were even worse compared to North Macedonia. So in this respect, I'm a bit doubtful that by offering a template that did not work well in the Western Balkans to Ukraine and Moldova and hopefully also to Georgia will produce the expected results. Let's not forget, we are in the 2023. It's 20 years since the Thessaloniki summit, and only Croatia managed to join European Union from the wagon of Western Balkans. And this is quite disappointing. When I hear Chancellor Scholz speaking about the acceleration of the EU accession process with Western Balkan countries, and by the way, the term acceleration appears also in the final declaration of EU Western Balkans Tirana summit of December last year, I am, let's say, quite hopeful that this might work out. But on the other hand, when I still hear the same discussion that first we need to reform the EU and then offer a seat to Western Balkan countries and possibly also to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, again I'm puzzled, because it reminds me the interview of Angela Merkel a few weeks before she became chancellor back in 2005. In an interview for Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, she was highlighting the need for the consolidation of the EU by allowing only Croatia to join EU and then see what we can do with other Western Balkan countries. And here we are. Thank you.
Mr. Polenz, now just we had Angela Merkel introduced. There's a discussion now about the failures of her Eastern policy. It's not the place now to discuss it. But anyway, I think the fact is that Germany, as a German diplomacy, as being like a main patron of Western Balkan integration, has been delaying this whole process. Also, Angela Merkel has not or has failed, I think we could say, on a number of points, for example, concerning the Berlin process, to have a dialogue with the civil society. It was a policy of stabilocracy. What do you think, looking back, if there would have been a more a real acceleration of integration in the Western Balkans, a different approach in the Eastern Partnership, could that have prevented today's situation, maybe the war even?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me as president of the German Association for Eastern European Studies, because we are something like a sister organization to your organization. And I see some from my former colleagues here in the auditorium. Welcome, Mr. Erler, Mr. Zöpel. Yes, your question. If you want to know why Putin started this war in 2014 and why he started the invasion in 1 year ago, you should read his essay on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. There is nothing of the Balkans in this essay, but he describes from medieval history why there are no Ukrainians at all. They are all Russians in his view. And therefore, the state of Ukraine has no right to exist as a state. These are the reasons for the war. And if you want to know what Putin wants to achieve with this war, you should look at the ultimatum he put to NATO in December 2021. And to put it short, he said the United States should end their military presence in Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, all the other states who became members of NATO after 91 have to leave NATO, hopefully immediately in his view. And he wants to restore the Europe, let's say from 1991, or let's even say it better, from Yalta. And this is what he has in mind. And also here, Balkan does not play any role in these considerations.
Yes, but being maybe more decisive on EU enlargement or integration, of course, I mean, I read this essay from Putin, but being more decisive on that, and also in Eastern Partnership, maybe he would not have dared to go that far. So that was the question.
If you look at possible mistakes which should have led to miscalculations of Putin, I would say that the sanctions after 2014 were by far too weak. And it was a mistake in 2015 to make Nord Stream 2. And this could lead to miscalculations. Yes, but I really think that his eagerness for revenge, like the very recommendable book from Michael Thumann describes, is so strong that even if he would have reacted tougher in 2014, he would not skip his idea of the great Russian Empire against the decadent West.
Irina, I would like to go a little bit into the details of a possible EU integration of Ukraine and Republic of Moldova. Ukraine, let's say Ukraine would become an EU member. I mean, it will be by far the largest country, not the most numerous, but the largest country. If you travel through Ukraine, especially in the east, and if you did do it before the war, I mean, it's sometimes you had the feeling it's almost an impossible transformation. You were a little bit more optimistic in what you said, but of course now, I mean, there is such a destruction. Just you ask yourself how could this country be rebuilt and become EU member? What do you think about it?
Thank you. I think actually this war also stimulates some internal processes in Ukraine, which will be good for Ukraine's European integration. So, for instance, now we see really genuine will to fight corruption, and because when the country is in the war and you see that some money are being stalled, you cannot afford this really. So there is a huge pressure from the society on Zelensky, and Zelensky himself understood that corruption kills actually. Yeah, so you need to really to get rid of corruption. Also, when it comes to reconstruction, Ukraine was probably the most energy inefficient country in Europe before the war. So we start building from scratch, maybe some houses, some quarters, and they will be energy efficient. They will, and if you rebuild production, so we had a lot of plants in the east, in Mariupol, for instance, which have been destroyed, which have brought a lot of pollution, which were not reconstructed since the Soviet times when they were built. So it's also an opportunity, if you want. This huge tragedy, destruction is also an opportunity to build everything in a different way, to modernize Ukraine, really. So I would be even more optimistic on this respect, yeah.
Cristina, well, Moldova is just has, I think, now 3 million or maybe only 2.5 million inhabitants. Very small country. Still, it's the poorest or one of the poorest countries of Europe, and it's also, I mean, it's not destroyed, thank God, but still, if you look at the country, it's really a task, isn't it?
It's always been a task, and
sorry, it's the country where you had the biggest theft ever, like in the last maybe 100 years. Like robbing $1 billion from 3 banks in 2014.
You're right. The country indeed did not benefit from the best governments since it gained independence in the early 1990s. And there are different reasons that I will not go into them. The most recent, let's say, story of Moldova that was left in the headlines of different media outlets in Europe and beyond is that it's a very poor country, it's a very corrupt country, and it doesn't deserve to become a member of the European Union, nor a perspective for that endeavor. I think the population has understood that very well, that with a captured state, everyone has a lot to lose. And with the election of a new president, with the parliamentary elections in 2021, with ousting the corrupt politician, Plahotniuc, who stole the 1 billion out of the budget, people gave a very clear signal that they want to live better. And I think the current government that the country has in place is for sure the most integral government that this country has seen. It's also a government full of enthusiasts, young people mostly studying abroad and then coming back with experience from abroad. It's a government where half of the people are women, except for, okay, now we have a new prime minister, but until 2 weeks ago, it was the president, the prime minister, the head of the constitutional court, the minister of internal affairs, all were women. So I think this country undergoes now big transformations. We've done a lot in a year and a half that the population was expecting. A lot is also delayed. For instance, we have talked a little bit on the hallways about the fact that, for instance, that judicial reform is not going as expected by the population. We're going through a very serious pre-vetting of the judges and prosecutors, and the system is really blocking the process from within. We have, in the last 2 weeks or so, over 30 judges who have resigned. So they're blocking the entire justice system so that the pre-vetting cannot have a successful ending for it. It's not easy. We are in touch with the Venice Commission, we're in touch with Brussels. We have good support and expertise helping us how to do it right. The country has invested its in energy independence more than it has ever done in the last 30 years. It's for the first time in history that the right bank of River Nistru does not use Russian gas. This in the context when the country was fully dependent on Russian gas until half a year ago, basically. So the country does undergo dramatic changes, and I think if this government will, have a bit more luck in terms of stability in the region, it could do more in the next years to come.
Irina, one question now, because Ukraine, because of the war, is in a very, very special situation. How opportune is it, or is it possible at all to discuss such issues as also Cristina mentioned, rule of law, corruption? I mean, there is corruption. I myself, for example, talk to soldiers on the front. Sometimes they are really frustrated of what is going on. Is it the moment to discuss all these issues, or should we wait until the end of the war?
It is necessary to discuss. It's a key for Ukraine's survival, actually, because corruption indeed kills. We saw later end of January unprecedented things in Ukraine from my perspective, when media reports led to the fact that some people were fired from their positions, like the deputy head of the presidential administration, because he was riding an expensive car and he was living in an expensive villa, and some other people. So we had 6 deputy ministers being fired, 6 chief heads of regional administrations, and many more. Some of them fired because of media reports, but some because anti-corruption institutions found that they have been involved into corruption, so the court procedures will take place. Also, I want to mention that unfortunately, in December, we observed that the EU and even the Venice Commission were not eager to criticize Ukraine harshly enough. For instance, one of the 7 conditions which EU outlined for Ukraine to implement when Ukraine received the candidate status was the reform of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. And the opinion which the Venice Commission issued in November was very positive, although the law which was supposed to reform the court was not good. It would not help to reform the court in the sense that we get new judges in this court, which are judges who have integrity record and so on. And so the civil society of Ukraine said, no, we don't like this report. It's not the case. We want to fight corruption now. We want to have judiciary reform now, because for Ukraine to reconstruct after the war, we need to have to be a corruption-free country. We need to have a strong and political independent judiciary. So the Venice Commission has issued a different report, which is now more objective and more critical, and the EU has also become more critical. So I like this change, and it also helps Ukraine to reform. Being tough is better, and indeed these fundamental things, corruption, rule of law, they're fundamental, so they have to be dealt with now.
I mean, there's also discussion around the new media law, about the minority law, and do you think it should be much more discussed also on the European level?
Well, it's been discussed. I mean, there are also Ukrainian NGOs who are doing regular monitoring. Every second month, they produce a report how Ukraine implement the 7 conditions. So the score, which was in January, was 5.5 out of 10. So Ukraine still has a way to go, but I think until autumn, if there is a political will, there is a possibility to implement these conditions completely, and then maybe to free the way for opening accession negotiations.
Mr. Bushati, now coming back to the Western Balkans, you mentioned the promise of Thessaloniki, which many people think it has been broken and will never be implemented. Well, we don't know, but the fact is that for about a decade, we can see the process of stabilocracy. We can also, if you allow, see, especially in Albania, that, for example, Prime Minister Edi Rama, he's really changing, also on a personal level, sometimes becoming more autocratic or at least authoritarian. What do you think about this process in the Western Balkans, having like leaders like Aleksandar Vučić, having countries like Republika Srpska and Bosnia? Could that have been prevented, having a more accelerated EU integration?
Yes, this goes without saying. Having a more meaningful EU accession process would help Western Balkans to be more democratic, more progressive, and more developed in terms of the economy. I mean, it is quite obvious that there has been some chances that have been missed by EU, and here I would like to refer to the Prespa agreement when North Macedonia made this painful concession because they changed the name of the country. EU was not there to deliver. When we were going with the justice reform, with the vetting process, and when I mentioned when I have been to Moldova in 2021, I was the special coordinator of the OSCE for the parliamentary elections. And I remember when I met President Sandu, she was asking me after the meeting about the justice reform in Albania, about the vetting process. And she was so keen and so eager to go through that process. And I said to her, please, if you want my humble advice, don't hurry up, because it's very complicated. And we are dealing also with side effects of this reform process that nowadays EU and our American friends don't even want to talk about it publicly, because there is always this fine balance between having an institution that is delivering justice, but it's always questionable the quality of the justice that is being delivered, and fighting corruption, which is very legitimate cause. So and countries have to fight in order to find this fine balance. So then we really need an accession template that addresses 3 key issues in the Balkans. First is demographics. Manuel Sarrazin is doing a really good job, and the new government in Berlin has reinvigorated the Berlin process, because back in 2014, when this process was launched, we were a bit afraid that we have been offered second-class membership to the European Union, and all leaders from the region were repeating after each other the same message, that for us this is a very important process, but we have to make sure that this is not a substitute to the accession process. A few years later, we found ourselves under a different trap. So in choosing between Berlin process and the so-called Open Balkan. So it started like a mini Schengen initiative, later on developed into an Open Balkan initiative, and there were lots of political ammunition being spent on this game, whether it's Berlin process or Open Balkan, rather than being focused on on the real substance, on the EU accession process. So in this respect, even with the Berlin process, with the implementation of the agreements that have been signed under the framework of Berlin process, I don't think that most of the pressing issues will be addressed in the region. First is demographics. I mean, we are signing agreements on mutual qualification of diplomas, but there are no doctors that would like to move from Belgrade to Tirana, or from Tirana to Pristina, or Pristina to Sarajevo. With all due respect, they're all looking towards Germany. If you speak with the deans of medical school in Tirana, there is a bleeding in terms of human resources. And this is very unfortunate, because I was learning at school that EU accession is about building Europe at home, not fighting Europe in Germany. But on the other hand, it is very difficult to convince a nurse, to convince a student to build their future in the region. As I used to say, people don't eat chapters. We can speak about new methodology, we can speak about clusters, we can speak about chapters, but at the end of the day, as Frank-Walter Steinmeier used to say, politics is about bread and butter. And if it's bread and butter in Germany, it should be also in Albania, or in Serbia, or in Bosnia, or in Kosovo. So first is demographics. Second is rule of law. This is very important issue. But sometimes the discussion about the EU accession process in our neighborhood is a bit schizophrenic, because we are focusing only on the rule of law, how many judges passed the vetting process, how many judges left their job, how many politicians went behind bars, only about statistics, and sometimes in order to impress Bundestag, to impress, I've been part of this machinery, so I know the playbook. And this is very important, because it's really the fundamental. It's really the fundamental. But this needs to be accompanied with a third component, which is the economic development. What we are seeing nowadays is the gap between us and the neighboring EU member states is not bridging. It's not bridging. So we need to bridge this development gap if we want to build Europe in our neighborhood. And why not to include Western Balkans, for instance, as a part of budgetary framework of European Union? Why not to include or to prepare Western Balkans to be part of the internal market, rather than spending political ammunition on Berlin process and Open Balkan? Instead of including or merging Open Balkan with Berlin process, I would prefer to speak about merging Berlin process or connecting Berlin process with the EU accession process. This would provide a real future for people in our region, and this would somehow also motivate the so-called agents of change in our societies, which have already left our societies. Thank you.
Mr. Poland, Mr. Poland, Angela Merkel's diplomacy has supported these so-called stabilocrats in the Western Balkans, and I think it's part of the responsibility for the situation there. And as you mentioned, demographics. I mean, German politicians went to Western Balkan countries to like acquire workforce instead of promoting rule of law or promoting better living conditions there. What do you think about this? Should the EU integration process and diplomacy now stay away from this policy of stabilocracy?
When the wall came down in 1989, 1990, and the EU enlargement processes started, there were considerations: what have the accession or the interesting states, those states who are interested in an EU membership, how should they look like before they can join? And then we had the Copenhagen criteria in 1993. And they require democracy, rule of law, protection of minorities, good governance, and an economy which is able to cover, exist within the competition of the common market. And I think all these criteria are still valid, because it would not help to take a country in without fulfilling these criteria. And then we had experiences which we should also remember. We had the experience that some of the hopes regarding Bulgaria, Romania were not fulfilled with regard to fighting corruption, etc., etc. There are still problems. And then I think we should also be honest and look at the shape of the European Union as it is. You know, there are 27 member states, very often, especially in geopolitical questions, not with the same opinion. We have problems to see all European member states fulfilling European values if you look to Hungary and Poland, etc., etc. And these weaknesses of the European Union are also playing a role when it comes to integration of other states. And we are lacking new efforts for deepening the European Union, because if you want to have cohesion amongst more and more countries, you need to have more in common. And if you look at the idea of the euro as a common currency, we have accepted that states who are fulfilling the euro criteria are not joining. And this is a problem, like Sweden, like Poland. And then we have the problem that also with Schengen, we are not able so far to extend Schengen to the whole European Union. And we should create even more projects for being on the same track with all 27 member states. And so we have to look realistically that the European Union is not in the best shape according to what it should be. And if you take this into account and combine it with the question we are discussing here for new accession, I would say, yes, I'm not so familiar with the processes with each country, I must admit, and I'm since nearly now 10 years not anymore member of the German Bundestag. So my stand of information is out of public accessible sources. But good governance is still a key element. And if you look, for instance, to Serbia, Serbia spoils a lot of developments in the region due to its revanchist and revisionist habit. They are still not accepting an independent Kosovo. They are using Republika Srpska to destabilize Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this is also hindering processes of accession. So I would say, yes, the European Union is often too bureaucratic. They should be more creative, true. But finally, we could see that regardless of all this bureaucracy, etc., Croatia made it. And we can ask, why did the others not? And so I would say there's a German proverb, I cannot translate it, jeder kehre vor seiner Haustür. And this is also true with the
Everyone should clean up his own mess.
This is also true with the Balkan, with the states in the Western Balkans.
Yeah. Manuel, I see that you would like to add something, right? So end of stabilocracy and beginning of supporting of good governance, rule of law, civil society, democratization.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix. I think, yes, that's the idea, but sometimes when you try to bring home something concrete, which is serving exactly into that what Ditmir described, then you prefer for dealing with those governments who are in government, or even you're dealing with a president while the government would be handling it due to the constitution of the country, because you want to bring this home. And you believe that it's fulfilling a small step of this, what Ditmir described. So what then you do? You prefer not to proceed, with regional cooperation, for example, because then you would have to make a deal with guys who are not fulfilling, who are not member of the Green Party family, usually, except one exemption. And then you have to make a decision.
But you could be more inclusive, right?
No, when it's about government treaties, you have to talk to governments. And of course, we try to include civil society more. And actually, the point is that the aim is to bring the civil society and the pro-actors, you called it, in a better positioning in the national arena of political discourse. And we are not good enough in that, except in Ukraine. And that's the difference. In Ukraine, in the Western Balkans, the old idea of enlargement doesn't work anymore in that way. The enlargement in the 90s was every Polish politician who is not fulfilling the path towards European Union, and Günther Verheugen, for example, would say you're not doing well, would be dismissed even not from government, but out of parliament next elections, for sure. And every taxi driver would say, we don't like Warsaw, they only do shit, we trust Brussels. We missed this moment in Western Balkans. But in Ukraine, we have a similar moment, perhaps not with trust to Brussels, but with trust in their own strengths to dismiss any politician tomorrow if they don't deliver. And this is lost in the Western Balkans somehow. And sometimes I believe perhaps civil societies from both regions, from Ukraine, Western Balkans, Moldova, could more interact on how to get this back, or how to learn from Aja, learn from Ukraine, how get back again the dismissal point, and you learn from them how you can lose it easily. The second point is that EU is not in a good shape, but yes, but it has never been in a good shape. And to a certain extent, no, and to a certain extent, we are in a better shape than ever. Let me first make.
Could you explain that?
Yes, let me first. I mean, it's.
That's okay. Very optimistic.
Okay, Mr. Polenz doesn't want to listen first to the argument and already denying it. If you look, for example, to the situation which came out in the monetary union after the euro crisis, now with the Corona bonds, if you see the new facilities which have been built up for military aid for Ukraine, even if you see the dynamics within the European Union after Corona about arguments towards financial solidarity with the South coming from Eastern Europe, there are points where European Union is stuck in decision-making, especially in areas where the classical competences of Brussels are not given. So you cannot decide with majority votes like migration and perhaps also like China. But in other areas where even there is no competence of European Union, it gained the competences. And even the question on the values, where I totally agree with Mr. Polenz, they are interesting developments which perhaps might fall into the right track by strengthening the competences of the ECJ to judge on internal questions regarding rule of law. So you could have a mixed picture, I think. The other point is, I think that also, perhaps it's not only that, it's also the political will in the region which is missing. And this was the argument I wanted to do. Because the political will in the enlargement countries in the East between 2004 and 2007 was a mix of political will which was really locally there and the willing to dismiss politicians. But the concrete argument was always done by the Commission. Like almost no decision of the enlargement stage politically wise, they were arguing with we like it to do, like closing down nuclear plants or whatever, Istanbul Convention. They was usually saying it's Brussels who wants it. So we don't have this in the moment. We don't have the strength of political will in the countries because we rely on the political will of leaders who perhaps don't have it, honestly. And we didn't find a way how to rely back to the people, but also this kind of the credibility of Commission to be the colonial power, to make the laws exactly like this, otherwise we will not deliver you the next step, has been weakened. And I strongly believe we can only come back to such a progress with small steps and delivering. So delivering North Macedonia this year is decisive, even perhaps for Ukraine. By the way, yeah, because if North Macedonia is not delivering, it's one more signal how you can be forever a candidate without delivering. And what can we do concrete to support North Macedonia to get this constitutional change done? How can we organize that the money which we promised in Berlin process on energy is delivered in concrete projects that the people can see this time we delivered. We not only signed a paper with 400 million, no, next year you can see the windmills or whatever is done. So trying to be concrete. On migration, Ditmir, Yes, but you have to be aware of first, Bulgaria, Romania have the same problem. Even parts of Eastern Germany have not enough doctors because they go to Hamburg. Second, as soon as you're a member of European Union, this is the idea, everybody can leave anyway. So I follow this argument, but it's not only about us sucking you out, it's also about local politicians not doing enough to prevent that.
We are slowly running out of time. Maybe just last two questions for Irina and Cristina. So I think you, three of you already mentioned that the European Union somehow is at a crucial point and also has to change itself in this process of ongoing integration. Irina and Cristina, what do you think about this change in the European Union itself, especially Ukraine being such a big country with such huge problem? I mean, this cannot go without a change in Brussels itself, right?
Yes, I think reform of the European Union and enlargement can go hand in hand, be parallel processes. I think the enlargement process has to be reformed. Now it's like nothing or everything. So you negotiate, you open chapters, you close chapters, and before you become a member, nothing is happening. You can, I think, if you fulfill conditions in certain key areas, you can become a part of the EU internal market already in this area. Sorry?
You need to comply fully to rule of law.
Absolutely, no, of course, these are, yes, but it's not about joining, it's about becoming part of EU internal market. For instance, Ukraine became a part of the EU's electricity system, yeah? During the war, it started exporting electricity to European Union, but stopped doing this because Russia started attacking energy infrastructure. Or Ukraine became a part of this transport network of the European Union. So there are opportunities, there are things, and this is something you can sell to the people. Or EU is now preparing to make Ukraine a part of the roaming system, of the roaming space, maybe Moldova as well, I don't know, of the European Union. So there are things you can do, and the same you can do for Western Balkans to show that there is a movement. You are getting closer to the EU. In parallel to negotiating, in parallel to, of course, conducting EU's internal reform. Yes, I think this is the most important thing, exactly.
Yeah, Cristina, I think you have the last word because we are running out of time.
Maybe just very quickly to add to what Irina was saying, I think regardless of what happens to Moldova and Ukraine, the European Union needs to change. I think the speed of challenges and the magnitude of challenges that the European continent today faces is showing that we need to, to reform not only the core of the European Union, but also the peripheries. I agree that these are processes that can go parallel. I don't see either of the two countries joining tomorrow the EU. It's going to be a very long process. We know about the homework that we need to do. We have serious domestic issues that we need to address, and that is going to take time. And I don't see why these two things cannot go in parallel.
Okay, thank you very much for participating. I also put these two questions to both of you because I think sometimes it's not only, so we should not, like from the West, I mean, I'm from the East myself, but anyway, from the West, we should not, advise you all the time, but also listen to you. So that's why I put this question to you. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for your attention.